Om Suvijnanam Chikitushe Janaya Satcha Satcha Vachasi Paspradhate Tayoryat Satyam Yataratrajiyas Tadit Somo Avati Hanti Asat. Excuse me, I have to see. So, we're talking about reorienting Orientalism. First, let me describe what Orientalism is. Literally, Orient is the East, and so Orientalism is everything that has to do with the East. The Orientalist is a scholar who studies the East, and that's it. But the term Orientalism, because it's directional, places the scholar engaged in the discipline at the center of the universe, while it displaces the object of study in the East. As Raj Vedam said in his talk, the Eurocentrism, that's what the Europeans were engaged in. So Edward Said wrote a book called Orientalism in the late 70s, 1970s, in which he characterizes Orientalism in a quite negative way. He says a very large mass of writers have accepted the basic distinction between East and West as the starting point for elaborate theories concerning the Orient, its people, customs, their mind, destiny, and so on. And it was used as a Western style for dominating, a European style in particular, for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient in their empires, particularly the British and French empires. In this way, it's the general group of ideas overriding the mass of material, that is, all the facts, shot through with doctrines of European superiority, various kinds of racism, imperialism, and so on. So all academic knowledge about India and Egypt is, he said, somehow tinged and impressed with, violated by, the gross political fact of European, principally British and French, colonial and American economic interest in these countries. In response to this, we find nationalist movements which have a rather defensive, reactive, or even paranoid nationalism, and that he characterizes, Said characterizes, as frequently woven into the very fabric of education, where children as well as older students are taught to venerate and celebrate the uniqueness of their tradition, usually and invidiously at the expense of others. I'll note that also another term for this in France was chauvinism. Okay, the French thought that their culture was superior, the British thought that their culture was superior, and now we find the same kind of defensive nationalism in India, where there are efforts on the part of scholars to show that India is superior to everyone. Now, fundamentalism is religious fervor, and fundamentalism itself means reading things literally, extremely literally, and not recognizing that authors sometimes use metaphor and various poetic techniques to convey their knowledge. And this religious fervor often tends to obscure notions of the sacred divine rather than to illuminate them, as if true notions of sacred and divine could not survive in fundamentalist combat. So Said says now in his study, that his study of Orientalism, so I familiarized her with these two extremes, the European Orientalist attitude of denigrating the Orient in respect to Europe and the reactions against it in defense of the various cultures that are subsumed under Orientalism. And now the European scholars since then, in the last 50 years, have been very aware of this European doctrine of subordinating the cultures of the Orient to their own cultures, and generally write in a way that is quite conscious of that. However, in Said's book, he points out that his study itself has very little to contribute to the facts about the Orient. He says the phenomenon of Orientalism, as I studied here, deals principally not with a correspondence between Orientalism and Orient, but with the internal consistency of Orientalism and its ideas about the Orient. In other words, it's studying Europeans, not studying India. Despite or beyond any correspondence or lack thereof with the real Orient. So it has nothing to do with India. It has to do with Europeans studying about India. And scholars who have grown up in recent years in institutions such as Columbia University, where Sheldon Pollock taught and Said also taught, you can see that their theses and their dissertations and their papers presented in the Columbia South Asia Seminar series imbibe these concepts. They talk about how colonial era concepts of political sovereignty, politics of modernity, the otherness, that is contrasting the European societies with the others, the Oriental societies, of political power used to dominate the Orient in various ways, and how they wielded their power, and how others confront this power, and there's this sort of combat going on between the nations that are dominated and the European empires. And opposite to Said's Orientalism, we find an Occidentalism, as in a book, for example, by Ian Baruma and Avishai Margalit. Occidentalism is exactly opposite of Orientalism. So it places the East at the center and views the West as the other. And you can see that it's stereotyping and painting a picture of the West as rootless, spiritually dead material, as opposed to the spiritual East and the poor, innocent, and faithful Easterners. Pure logic is cold and stripped of human feeling, and the bourgeois West compared to the pure rural life. And you can see that these themes were also used in films in India in the 1980s and 1990s, where the city life is bad and the country, the poor villagers are the good guys. Now, seeing those two opposite poles, then we have to, and seeing the theses and so forth that were written using those theoretical terms, even Pollock himself recognized that these were all theoretical works, and they were all within a certain dialogue with themselves. And it displaced the actual object of analysis. So it took attention away from actually studying ancient India, or even modern India, towards studying the Europeans again, and the opposite with Occidentalism. And this theoretical dialogue then becomes what I call the New Orientalism. It's the New Orientalism because only those people who engage in this theoretical dialogue are considered to be scholarly, and anyone who doesn't engage in it is considered naive, innocent, and not worthy of being given academic positions and so on. And so the genuine knowledge is being neglected in favor of these theoretical concerns. And unfortunately, that's true also of the opposite in the Occidentalism, that there's this discussion going on. We see even in this conference, many papers have been devoted, including mine, to these theoretical questions and not to the substantial issues of the knowledge that India has. Now, Hegel, as again Raj Vedam recognized, had recognized that consciousness was reality, which is a primary doctrine of Vedanta, and yet he criticized India as lower on his scale in what he called a sort of historical dialectic of consciousness, where one worldview displaced the next in a hierarchy from less evolved to more evolved. And this conception of Hegel's has dominated the humanities. In Germany, humanities are called Geisteswissenschaft, which is the terms Hegel used. Geistgeschichte is the history of spirit, as Hegel called it. And humanities was the history of that spirit. Now, Marx turned that upside down and made materialism the center. He said it's not consciousness that determines existence, but social existence that determines consciousness. And he denigrated the voluntary conscious subject in favor of social relations and a purely materialistic worldview. If you heard my brother David Scharf's talk last night, you were aware of the contradictions within materialism. But Kant then goes on in his Communist Manifesto to talk about class struggles and so on, and you can see that what I called the doctrines of Orientalism are actually an adoption of Kantian, Marxist history into the humanities, so that the study of India now is studied not for its own sake as the knowledge, but as class struggle, the dominated versus the dominating, and so on. And we see that continuing in the dialogue that we have today, even in these conflicts. Now, I don't need to go into the materialism, but fundamentalism, as I mentioned, is focusing on the literal interpretation. If we focus on literal interpretation, I choose this picture here at Maharishi International University of the holy tradition of masters who have passed down knowledge to Gurudev and Maharshi, and you see Gurudev is sitting there showering knowledge on the whole globe, and the globe is situated below his feet. And then one has to ask, on what ground are all those sages sitting? Now, if one takes this as communicating literal cosmogonic or cosmological or geographical knowledge, one would be completely misled by this, right? This is not a map intended for that purpose. It's a picture which is intended metaphorically to talk about the river of the transmission of knowledge. And similar was done, we find in the Puranas, where in the Puranas we find descriptions of many heavens stacked above the flat earth and many hells below, and the flat earth as a ring of continents with circular oceans between, seas consisting of salt, sugarcane juice, liquor, ghee, curd, milk, and fresh water. Now, Chris Minkowski analyzed these, and he also mentions that there are, of course, other works which give quite exact knowledge about the geographies, as opposed to the fantastic numbers which are mentioned in the Puranas, so that we have to conclude that the geographical knowledge from other sources is correct, but there were other modes than the Puranas of conveying that knowledge, and that the purpose, therefore, of the Puranas was not to convey exact knowledge of geography and cosmology. It was more like what Dante did with the inferno where he placed all his immoral colleagues of contemporary and preceding times in various hells, and people he considered good in various purgatories and heaven. So when we come to evaluating what knowledge does, there are various terms we use that prejudice what that knowledge is. When talking about the sciences, we use the word discover. One discovers various facts. When we talk about humanities things, we talk about creation, or in the arts, design. But this is a very interesting expression by Paul Graham about the roots of Lisp, where he mentions that although McCarthy designed the language, it's interesting that he made a discovery that the language of Lisp could be written in itself. So it has a self-referral quality. Similarly, Panini, 2 minutes. Similarly, Panini, we can say, composed the Ashtadhyayi, but also note that he discovered the efficacy of generative grammar. And Vedic seers, we could say, they compose their hymns, but perhaps discover the value of fire or other aspects of consciousness or mind, feelings, and so on, which are composed in the hymn. So we should think again then, what does it mean the Veda is eternal? So when we urge the study of things for the sake of understanding rather than engaging in political combat, which is actually a Marxist thing, a pure adoption of European ideas that India should eschew and engage in real knowledge rather than political banter. And now my colleague Tanuja Ajotikar will give an example of interpretation of themes in the Veda themselves and how they have had fundamentalist, Marxist interpretations, as well as our own interpretation, which is a consciousness-based one. Thank you.
Thank you.
And why don't we save questions until after Tanuja's talk?
Perfect.